Yes, guys, welcome to the next video. So in this one, we're going to be looking at measures of inflation rates. So of course, in the previous lessons, we just looked at obviously inflation and the impact it has on the economy. But now, how do we actually measure this and get a read-in to understand what the inflation is like in the economy and what the Fed or central banks can actually do about this? So measures of inflation. So to measure inflation, we use mainly three parameters, and there's two sort of more premium ones that we look at. The main ones are going to be the consumer price index and the producer price index. There's also the wholesale price index, but I explained why we don't use it as much. So the CPI. The CPI is a measure that examines a weighted average of prices of a basket of goods and services which are of primary consumer needs. They include transportation, food, and medical care. So what this is an average for understanding the basic needs and purchases of the normal consumer around. In this case, it would be America, for example. So of course, this includes transportation, food, everything like that. There are some arguments that would say the CPI data isn't going to be the most accurate piece of data because you don't have one average man in the world, right? So all of this is based on sort of estimates of what they expect everyone to be using. Then the producer price index is a family of indexes that measures the average change in selling prices received by domestic producers of intermediate goods and services over time. As you can tell from the title, this is inflation for the sellers of the products. So here CPI measures the people that are buying it, and then here it's the inflation for the people that are selling it. So of course, as inflation increases, the goods that they buy to actually manufacture and produce their products, that's also going to increase in price, and that has an adverse effect on the CPI because, of course, this is the stage just before. So now these are the main two parts that we look at. The WPI, which is the wholesale price index, it doesn't cover services, whereas PPI covers goods and services. Hence why we don't use the WPI as much. But of course, it's always good to know what it actually is. And yeah, so let's look at a little overview of how we actually use the CPI and PPI and where to find it as well. So you can review this data on Forex Factory, Trade and Economics, and any other FX sources. So these are the main, this Forex Factory is going to be the main place that you look at for sort of quick data that you may see, percentages and stuff, and also when the data is coming out. So the main thing is you must understand what the impact of it is. So you're not just looking at that data and seeing if it's red, green, or neutral. You're actually going to understand what it actually means. So typically you have a prediction percentage increase. So what it means is if we expect CPI to come out, what they're going to do is based on, the different type of indicators they have, economic research, what they will do is they'll put the previous, I believe, on the right-hand side, and then they're predicted in the central area. So they're going to predict that CPI for this month is going to increase by 0.5%. Now, typically, if you have a prediction percentage increase, price will usually, so if it's 0.5% is the estimate for the next month, but you see a massively fluctuating number. So if it's massive in this case would be just a few decimal percentage points. So if it's, for example, 0.1% instead of 0.5, or if it's the other way around, where it's very inflationary and it's 0.9% or even more than that, going up to 1% inflation for that month would be a lot. And that's where you start to see massive swings in the market. Most recently, in one of the CPI releases, I believe it was also expected to be 0.7% or something like that, where in fact it was actually 0.3% lower than expected. And then we saw a massive shift in the market. These percentage points at the end of the day, because this is just the monthly data, it's really going to add up, every single month until that year reading. So these sets of data are produced monthly for the month-on-month readings. But you've also got other readings such as quarter on quarter and also year on year. Like I said, there are also yearly readings that the Fed will use to monitor inflation in comparison to their goals of 2% a year. So if you remember back to the inflation lesson, um, the Fed and other central banks, they always aim for inflation of 2% a year because this is healthy. It promotes economic activity to grow because, of course, you need that inflation. But any more than that can be harmful to the economy and also to the consumers. So there's something that I need to introduce to you called the core CPI. So the usual CPI data that we see, such as over here, you're going to realize there's CPI month on month and then also core CPI month on month. This is the more important reading that we get. The normal CPI includes food and energy, which can cause massive fluctuations in the data released, showing misleading results. Now, these fluctuations can be caused by natural disasters and certain geopolitical events that make certain commodities very volatile. As an example, if wheat, as an example, if we look at wheat, if there was a drought, then of course the supply is going to be affected. Therefore, you might get massive fluctuations in the price. So, what did the Fed use instead of the normal CPI? It's something called the core CPI, but also known as the PCE index, personal consumption expenditures, instead because it is not prone to the short-term fluctuations seen in CPI data released. Now, of course, you've got to understand with the normal CPI data that is released, it's going to be short-term fluctuations. So like I said, if there was a drought, for example, for wheat, maybe for the next few months, you might get a massive increase in inflation due to the supply and the demand factors. Whereas the PCE index actually gets rid of that. So PCE index is essentially what the Fed prefer to use. Now, this is something that I'm going to get into more detail in my course, particularly in the Fed funds rate video. I believe that's coming either in the second or the third section. So just understand this as a concept for now, and then we'll obviously get into the numbers later on. So let's look at some Fed analysis. So how do the Fed actually respond to this data? And this is the most important thing because yes, understanding what happened with CPI and how much it grew is okay, but we need to understand the effect that it has on the market and also what the Fed are going to do with their monetary policies, with interest rates, everything like that. So the Fed monitor both CPI and PPI, but more importantly, the core CPI or the so-called PCE. They use this data as a source of understanding inflation year on year, quarter on quarter, and the month on month. If they see a steady increase throughout the months and eventually showing around a 2% growth in inflation, this is sustainable and is one of the goals of the Fed. Every year, the Fed will set out some parameters and some targets that they want to aim for. Usually, they want to see a 2% growth in inflation throughout the year. So what happens if the Fed see higher inflation? The effect that will have is they'll start to promote deflationary conditions. Now, because of one CPI reading, they're not exactly going to do this, but they need quite a few. And also when it gets to that year-on-year reading, let's just take a look at what's going on in the world at the moment. So at the moment, we just got some CPI readings for the whole year. It was year on year. Rather than the 2% goal that they were looking for, we actually got a 4% goal. Not goal, but a result. This, as you can tell, is very inflationary. In normal economic times, you won't be getting this unless there's geopolitical reasons and everything. But of course, one of the biggest reasons right now is because of COVID, because of what the Fed had to do with their money supply. So it's coming to a point right now where we have to promote some deflationary conditions. Otherwise, what they call transitory inflation, so they say it's temporary because of COVID and what they've done with the money supply. They say it's transitory. This eventually could become permanent if they don't do anything with their policies. So how about the opposite? What if they see lower inflation? That means that they may start to promote inflationary conditions, because what this means, lower inflation, it means that prices of things are getting cheaper. But the effect on that as well is you're not only going to see cheaper prices, but you're also going to see a loss of jobs. Now, these things are not it's not the job and employment thing doesn't happen because of the inflation, but everything comes together with monetary policy, with everything. If you're in very deflationary times, you're going to see the Fed want to promote inflationary conditions to get the economy to start moving, to see that economic activity. So keep this all in consideration for later on in the course. All of this data is very important because we've got to understand where we are, so where the Fed are in terms of the market cycle. So this is something that we're going to explore in more detail. But yeah, so how does this relate to inflation data that we are seeing? And therefore, what can we expect the Fed to do soon? So yeah, guys, that's it for this lesson. I hope you understood everything. And yeah, it's just a little introduction into starting to understand what Forex Factory is, because what a lot of retail traders do particularly is they look at the data, for example. So let's just take a look at this screenshot right here. They take a look at this example right here, see if the data is just simply red or green, and then they think buy or sell. And that is not what we actually do. So yeah, guys, that's it for this lesson. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.